Hello, my name is Dominic Reisig. I'm with the North Carolina State Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology. This is a corn and sorghum insect update for 2017. I'll be speaking first briefly about sugarcane aphid and sorghum. We'll move on to talking about seed treatment use for different insect pests in corn, and then we'll finish up with talking about stink bug management in corn. For those of you who haven't yet met the sugarcane aphid, if you plant some sorghum you will. Although it doesn't overwinter here in our state, it moves rapidly from the south, we think blown by wind currents, and is essentially found throughout the state by mid to end of season. Here's the spatial distribution in 2016, and these were just counties that I heard about and was able to confirm the presence of the aphid. It's likely in every county where we have any sort of sorghum. It is a very, very damaging pest. The potential yield loss can be great, and this changes throughout the seasons. As the grain becomes more mature, the yield loss is lessened, but it still can injure the crop throughout the season. Even just prior to harvest, once the grain is mature, the aphids can move up into the head and cause problems plugging up combines. So this is a pest that needs to be controlled throughout the season. For growers who don't produce grain sorghum but produce molasses from sweet sorghum, the Brix can drop to an unusable level in several days, and because of this, we were able to have an emergency exemption for the use of Silvano Prime this year, and we'll be hoping to do the same for next year. For our grain producers, we have what I consider to be a fairly simple threshold in that it's usable, and that's pre-boot through the boot stages. 20% of the plants infested with honeydew and established colonies present should trigger a spray, and heading through the dough stage, 30% of the plants infested with colonies present and heavy honeydew should trigger a spray. There's nothing magical about these thresholds in terms of if you sprayed at 20 or 30% versus 50%, what should you expect the yield loss to be? These thresholds were just developed through experience, through people that knew that if you treated at these earlier stages, you'd have a chance to get ahead of the insect before it was able to double its population in a day and a half like it can do. You don't need to memorize these thresholds. You can go to sorghumcheckoff.com, pest management website that you see listed here, where you can find the thresholds for this aphid. We were fortunate enough to do some insecticide screening for the insect this year, and this was a collaborative project with the new regional grains agent, Scott Tilley. Scott did much of this project. I'm just showing his results here, and this is aphids per leaf. Scott actually counted individual aphids on these leaves of sorghum throughout the canopy of the plant. And much like what they found in other states, both Transform and Savanto appear to be superior products for this aphid. So we don't recommend any of the other chemistries that you see here. In fact, some of them, such as Centric, are not labeled for this crop. You can stay up to date on both corn and sorghum information at entomology.ces.ncsu.edu. Throughout the year, if you click on these blog articles and scroll down and enter your email, you'll be automatically entered into a weekly email list that'll send you up-to-date information. So you'll know if we're able to have a Section 18 for Transform next year, or if you produce sweet sorghum, you'll know if we're able to obtain an emergency exemption for Silvano Prime. I'd like to transition now into corn and talk a little bit about seed treatments. We currently have several major insect issues in corn at this time, one of which is over-reliance on insecticidal seed treatments. We have effective way to manage at-plant insect pests: timely planting, weed management, rotation, starter fertilizer, proper drainage. These are methods that have been known for centuries, even in our state. However, because of our modern production systems, we're often not able to employ some of these cultural management techniques, and as a result we've become very reliant on insecticidal seed treatments. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time today to talk about efficacy of these treatments, and then maybe some of the trends that we're seeing in the future with the use of these treatments. Stink bugs are still a major issue. They're an on-again, off-again issue. For some producers, they're an every year issue. For most producers throughout the state, they're an occasional issue. We're going to talk about how you can make that treatment decision and how you can scout for this insect in the upcoming season to see if you need to treat for this insect or not. What we'll not be covering today, but what we are seeing an issue with, is corn earworm. I think it's important to keep in mind when we talk about corn earworm that Even though we see corn earworm in a lot of our field corn fields, this is not a yield limiting pest in timely planted corn. I think it's important to keep in mind that our BT is very effective against some major yield limiting pests. Think about European corn borer or southern cornstalk borer. These can wreak havoc on the system, and there's increasing evidence that BT is really limiting the population of these insects and is still very effective. However, BT has long been billed for its yield enhancing or at least control properties for secondary pests, things like corn earworm. Again, we know that this is not a yield limiting pest, but BT is being marketed as effective for these insect pests. So, if you're paying for a product that's being marketed as effective against the insect, is it? My counterpart, Dr. Francis Rie Jones at Clemson, and myself have been monitoring this in corn throughout time. And what we've done is we've monitored the percent reduction in kernel injury. We go through and we take very careful measurements about how much of the kernels corn earworm eats. And we found that over time, relative to non-BT control lines, stacks containing Cry 1A105, that's contained in double pro or triple pro, have had reducing efficacy over time. So we've noticed a trend of anywhere from 70 to 90% efficacy several years ago to around 60% efficacy. Now, I want to be clear that these are average trends where we've measured them. We see fields where these traits are still very effective for corn earworm. We see fields where it looks like they're not effective at all. It doesn't appear to be related to pest pressure. We've noticed that the kernel injury in non-BT hybrid appears to be unrelated to the injury that we're seeing in BT hybrid. And now we have solid evidence that this is due to resistance of corn earworm for these traits in BT corn. But again, because we don't think that corn earworm is a yield limiting pest in corn, this is probably not an issue for corn producers, and will not be something that we cover in detail in today's presentation. I'd like to answer several questions with today's presentation. The first question is, can you boost seed treatments with an in-furrow insecticide application? Secondly, are there any new products out there? And thirdly, what can we do if we lose insecticidal seed treatments? So loop back to the first question, what would it look like if you were to use an in-furrow alone without an insecticidal seed treatment? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it down by pest and sort of answer each one of these questions by pest. One of the most important pests and common pests that we have in many of our fields are wireworms. A lot of this information comes from a master's student that finished up with me recently, Forrest Howell, and one of the things that Forrest did is actually identify some of the species that are present in North Carolina cornfields. His findings were similar to previous findings where we have a complex of species that seems to be dominated by one specific wireworm. If we have a species complex, we may expect variable performance with insecticides. So it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about wireworms, we're speaking about a complex of species. What may be in your field may or may not be in your neighbor's field. What I've done is I've created a table, and I've looked at a bunch of the trials that I've had throughout the years, and I've rated these insecticides on a scale of 0 to 9. 0 being that insecticide is not effective at all, 9 is being it's 100% effective or excellent control. You can see that N equals, and that just represents the number of the trials that the insecticide's been in. So for Poncho 1250 and wireworms, I've seen it in 4 trials, whereas an insecticide like Cruiser 500, I've only seen it in 1 trial. So I have more confidence in the 4 trials than I do the 1 trial, but you can sort of make your own judgment based on that there. And you can see that Poncho 1250 is a superior seed treatment for wireworm control in North Carolina corn. And when we get down to some of the marginal ones are the in-furrows, things like counter or capture without the seed treatments, and it looks like we're not boosting insecticidal seed treatments with in-furrow treatments. I'll delve into that in a minute. Okay, these data are from the master student Forrest Howell, and one of the things that Forrest did was he went out into these different treatments and he looked at the number of plants that were injured by wireworms and white grubs. So you can see that untreated had more injured plants than Poncho 500 and Poncho 1250. Kind of interesting to us was that there weren't significant differences when Poncho 500 had counter added with an in-furrow, or when Poncho 1250 had counter added added with an in-furrow. And I think that's reflective of the table that I showed you previously, where it looked like we really weren't boosting the efficacy of a seed treatment with an in-furrow. It's important to keep in mind that when we look at an in-furrow like Counter, the Counter is a very broad spectrum insecticide, and it not only kills insects, but it's also a nematicide. And so our reigning hypothesis is that Counter is likely killing nematodes in the soil. That's a good thing if you have plant parasitic nematodes. So we actually have nematodes out there that are killing pest insects in the soil, and if Counter kills those good nematodes, we may be shooting ourselves in the foot. And in fact, that's what we think happened in these trials here. So to the answer of the first question, can we boost seed treatments with an in-furrow treatment? At least in the case of something like a broad spectrum insecticide like Counter, it doesn't appear so. Okay, are there any new seed treatments out there? The answer is yes. We have one called Lemevia. The active ingredient is chlorantraniliprole, and you may be familiar with this as a foliar spray, as Coragen or Prevathon, and it's also one of the components in Besiege. It's labeled as a seed treatment, and it's offered on many of the new Pioneer hybrids packaged with Cruiser 250. So although it's a new active ingredient, it's packaged with an old active ingredient, Cruiser 250, which is a neonicotinoid insecticide. I think we need to be a little bit careful if we talk about over-treating it. The label specifically says, do not apply other seed treatment products to seed already treated with Lemevia. So that may or may not be important if you are trying to treat seed yourself. I have not had this product in any trials with wireworms, so I'll defer to some of the data of Tom Kuhar from Virginia Tech. Now, Tom's not looked at the Lemevia or chlorantraniliprole component by itself, but he has looked at it packaged with Cruiser. And if you look at something like damaged seed, this is looking at corn, or wireworm mortality, it looks like that it's comparable to Cruiser alone, or Poncho Votivo or Poncho, and that it does provide some enhanced control relative to the check. Here it is in a field trial, and it looks like it's comparable to Cruiser 250 alone. Without actually pulling out the Lemevia or chlorantraniliprole component alone, it's difficult to say, at least for me from the data that I've seen, what this product may be doing against wireworms. So this is sort of a question, but because it's packaged with the Cruiser 250, it should have some wireworm efficacy, at least due to the Cruiser 250. This is the table similar to what you saw before for wireworms, but for white grubs. It's very similar in that the top performing seed treatment was Poncho 1250. I do have an in-furrow up there near the top, Capture LFR, that's by Finthrin in-furrow. When we get down to some of our moderate products, those are sort of mid to low rates of seed treatment. And again, note the Poncho 1250 with the Counter in-furrow. And that can be seen here. This was a trial with only white grubs present because white grubs chew on the roots of the plants. What the student Forrest did here was he weighed the roots. So this is root mass. And if you look at these trial results from 2015, the heaviest roots in that trial were from plots that were planted with Poncho 1250. And in fact, when we added Counter to Poncho 1250, the roots weighed less. So again, this is one of those incidences where we think that by putting this broad spectrum in-furrow, we're actually killing some of these beneficial nematodes that may be killing soil insects. We do have some efficacy data of this Lemevia or chlorantraniliprole product for white grubs. We've seen it in a number of trials in 2016, and I've just pulled out some of the results here. And if we break this apart, and we can look at the graph on the left, it's the number of plants injured by white grubs in these plots. You can see that the white grubs injured the most plants in the untreated plots. When we look at the Lemevia or chlorantraniliprole component alone, there's really no significant difference from the control, but there's trends for reductions in feeding. When you package that product with Cruiser 250, it looks like the Cruiser 250 is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and then our Poncho 1250 plots really look the best in terms of injured plants. And that's sort of mirrored in the yield that you see there on the right. We had 190 bushels in untreated plots. Our highest yields were from Poncho 1250, where we were able to increase our yield by over 30 bushels with the seed treatment, which of course more than pays for itself in the presence of the insect. Here's a photo of some of the plots. This is Poncho 1250. This is Lamivia, and then this is the untreated. So a little bit of a subtle difference there, but you can see that we have some missing plants in the Lamivia and untreated plots compared to the Poncho 1250, and that Poncho 1250 plots just look a little bit thriftier than those other two treatments. Here's one more trial that you can see for white grubs, and this is just a yield slide. And again, when we pull out those different Lamivia components alone at the 500, 750, or 250 labeled rates, looks like they're maybe not providing a significant increase in yield, but there's a trend for an increase in yield. And again, Poncho 1250 provides us significant increase in yield in the presence of a pest like white grub. Okay, I'm going to transition now to bill bugs because I want to continue to talk about Lamivia, and I think it's important that I kind of qualify some of what I'm going to say, what I saw this year with results that I saw in previous years. So the first look we had at this product was in 2014. This is just injured plants per row foot, and you notice that this was a very low pressure trial. So if you look at our untreated plots, only 6 out of 100 of those plants were injured by bill bugs. So maybe not some of the most challenging pressure that we could put this insecticide under. The Lamivia components by themselves did not appear to provide a significant reduction in injury, but there were trends for a reduction in injury, so I was sort of excited about this product for bill bugs. Packaged with the Cruiser 250, they didn't separate out from Poncho 1250. These are results from 2015. You see them in the white-green bars there. This is a trial with a number of injured plants counted again. Again, Cruiser 250 plus Lamivia didn't separate out from the Poncho 1250. It appeared to be a very effective product. And these are some photos from those trials. You can see the untreated plots, Poncho 1250, and then Cruiser 250 packaged with Lamivia 250. So it looked like in 14 and 15, under low to moderate pressure, that this was a pretty effective package and was comparable to Poncho 1250. 2016 was a very challenging year for corn seed treatments, especially so for bill bugs. If you were able to get your corn in on time, we had a 2-week period that was cold and wet. That's bad for seed treatments because the corn plant isn't growing, but the insects are out there feeding, and so the plant just can't outrun the injury that it receives, and seed treatments aren't taken up well. It's a whole litany of problems. Here's photos of those treatments from this year, 2016 trials. Cruiser 250 and Lamivia just did not look as good as Poncho 1250. You can see the untreated in the middle, Cruiser 250 and Lamivia on the right, Poncho 1250 on the left. Here it is in another trial, untreated, Poncho Votivo, Poncho 1250, and Cruiser 250 and Lamivia. So based on my experience in this year under high pressure, less than optimal conditions, this product is probably going to fall in as a moderately effective seed treatment for bill bugs, with our most effective management tool still being Poncho 1250. Now I want to talk a little bit about Poncho 1250. This is something that we've looked at least for 4 years for southern corn bill bug, and this is a graph showing the percent of plants with feeding relative to untreated corn. What we do in our trials is we simply walk down the middle rows and we count plants that have bill bug hits. So just because it has a bill bug hit doesn't mean that it's economically damaging. It just means that it has the distinctive bill bug feeding, where you can see that the insect inserted its mouth parts below the soil, the plant grew, and the whorl unfurled, and you have that distinct 3 or 4 hole through the leaf feeding pattern that's synonymous with bill bugs. So if we're looking at a product like Poncho 1250, we'd expect to have fewer of those feeding hits relative to the untreated control. And in fact, that's what we saw. Most of those relative to untreated corn, Poncho 1250 was what I would call 80% effective if we're just looking at feeding hits. Notice that we had 2 trials in 2014, 4 in 2015, 4 in 2016, and notice the drop that we've seen over 4 years. This year we actually had more feeding in Poncho 1250 plots relative to untreated control. So again, I want to emphasize this is not economic feeding. The Poncho 1250 plots looked phenomenal compared to the untreated control. This is a product that we need to continue to use. But what this does tell me is that Southern Core Billbug may be developing a taste for Poncho 1250. So even though it's not economically injuring the corn, it's feeding on it a little more. We're seeing more injury out there. This is probably the development of resistance. And this would make sense if you think about how much we're using this one product for this one insect in this one area. If we keep using the same product year after year, resistance is bound to develop. Okay, enough of the bad news. I'd like to transition now to stink bugs. And 2015 was really a banner year for stink bugs. Growers dealt with it. There weren't a lot of answers out there, and we were fortunate enough to have a PhD student working on stink bugs at the time, Arun Babu, and he continued his work on in 2016, and we'd like to show you some of the results that we found with his trials here today, hoping to have products in the next few years that should be able to help you even more. One of the things that we looked at was insecticide efficacy. This is a trial that we had several years ago in corn, and we were trying to see really simply which of these insecticides was more effective for brown stink bugs in corn than the other. I want to point out to the 7 days after treatment rating. You can see that there were a lot of nymphs in this corn, and that most of those products that were pyrethroids seemed to work equally well for stink bugs in corn. We weren't able to tell any differences between them. You notice that the numbers increased over time. That's because the stink bugs were moving into the corn in this trial. But we don't think necessarily that all of these pyrethroids are created equal. For example, this one insecticide, Discipline, is bifenthrin, and we know at least in cotton and soybeans that bifenthrin is a more effective pyrethroid compared to other types of pyrethroids. So one of the things we wanted to do was to ask the question, is bifenthrin more effective than other pyrethroids for brown stink bugs in corn? So we spent a lot of time developing a bioassay. We weren't really able to answer that question very well, but we were able to test bifenthrin versus another insecticide. This young man helped me this summer. He compared bifenthrin and zeta-cypermethrin. Zeta-cypermethrin is known as Mustang Max. And if you spray bifenthrin at 6.4 ounces per acre and Mustang Max at 4 ounces per acre, you're spraying the same amount of active ingredient of product per acre. So you're spraying 0.025 pounds active ingredient product per acre. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to say, okay, let's test these insecticides head to head at the same dose and see if they kill stink bugs equally. Well, what we found was that bifenthrin is at least 10 times more lethal to stink bugs than is zeta-cypermethrin or Mustang Max. So at least when we're comparing these two insecticides, it seems like a no-brainer. Bifenthrin is more lethal, let's spray that. Next year we hope to use this bioassay a little bit more and test some more of the pyrethroids that are out there, but this is going to help us be able to answer some of these insecticide efficacy questions in the future. I want to spend a little bit of time to talk about thresholds before I move into some of the sampling work that we've done. And the reason I want to do that is because if you're going to sample the insect, you need to know the threshold that's there. So we have adopted the Georgia thresholds, and these have been separated out into different times of the growing season. We have a threshold that we employ prior to tasseling, and that's 25% infested plants. We recommend that you scout the entire plant, and that's to prevent this crook deer syndrome. If we think that there's a short time period, maybe 8 days to 2 weeks, where the insect can feed through the plant when the primary ear is developing, that can interfere with development and cause that crook deer syndrome. Once the plants have tasseled, the ear is formed, it has silk out there and it's receiving it. At R1 we'd say you need to treat when there's 50% infested plants, and we think that'll help you prevent some of the missing kernels that you see in this photo here. At R3 you can tolerate more stink bugs. You need to have every single plant infested in the field to prevent some of the kernel injury that you see here. These are kind of the thresholds that we've been using year after year. One of the questions that this PhD student of mine, Arun Babu, wanted to answer was, can we modify our sampling recommendations a little bit? So you just heard me say we recommend that you scout the entire plant. Can we modify those sampling recommendations a little bit so that we can hone in on where stink bugs are and really search less of the plant that's there? So what he did was he carefully followed stink bugs on corn plants throughout the season, and I'm going to show you some of his results. So you're going to see a series of graphs, and each of these graphs represents a different growth stage of the corn. So the graph on the left is corn at V4, the graph in the middle is corn at V8, and the graph on the right is corn at V12. The dotted line is the height of the corn plant, and you can see that that's there in centimeters. Each of those little dots represents where Arun found stink bugs. So you can see that at V4 he's found most of the stink bugs at the base of the plant. As the corn matures up to V12, the stink bugs become more distributed on the plant. And that makes sense when we think about the growing point of the plant. So if we look at where the growing point of the plant is, it's not above the soil surface until V5 or V6. So those stink bugs are going to be found at the bottom of the plant like you saw earlier at V4, because the growing point is right at or below the soil surface. Once the plants reach V12, the growing points are at each of those different nodes where the leaves are, so the stink bugs tend to spread out throughout the plant. Once corn tassels, produces the ear, and the ear begins receiving pollen and developing kernels, the stink bugs become more and more concentrated around that developing ear. So you notice that at R2 and R4, the stink bugs are concentrated around that ear as it's forming. You notice that prior to tasseling, they're still distributed throughout the plant. So we're going to use the results from 2016, continue the study into 2017 to help develop management recommendations to avoid those whole plant searches so the growers can really hone their scouting efforts on the correct stage of development for the corn and avoid whole plant searches when those are unnecessary for stink bugs. This concludes the presentation on corn and sorghum insect management for 2017. Thank you.